IXT New York Wilderness, near Lake Ontario. Day 16827. The air is thick with mosquitoes and the smell of pine rot. Ensign Pierre Delancey, of the Troupes de la Marine, curses under his breath. He shoves a saturated, low-hanging branch away from his horse's face. The animal is a wreck, lathered in sweat, flanks heaving, its legs trembling from navigating the endless maze of deadfall and sucking mud. This New France is a green hell. Delancey's patrol has been hacking its way west from Fort Frontenac for 3 days, supposedly on a show of force ordered by the governor, the Marquis de Denonville. But here, the forest swallows all force. They are lost, exhausted, and their heavy wool uniforms are soaked through. Suddenly, Delancey freezes. He hears a sound. Not the crack of a twig under a deer's hoof, not the clumsy crash of his own men. It's a rhythmic, soft, impossibly fast thud, thud, thud. From the gloom of the hemlock grove to his left, a man emerges. He is Haudenosaunee, Iroquois. He wears only a breechclout and moccasins. His body is lean, slick with sweat, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the French patrol. He doesn't look at them. He doesn't slow down. He simply passes them, his body locked in a relentless, ground-eating trot. In his hand he carries a small, intricately beaded belt, a string of wampum. In 10 seconds he is gone, swallowed by the forest ahead. Pierre Delancey stares into the trees, his heart suddenly cold. His own messenger, on the patrol's strongest horse, had turned back a day ago, the animal lamed by a hidden root. That man, he was moving as if the forest wasn't even there. What Ensign Delancey had just witnessed wasn't merely a feat of endurance. It was a weapon. It was the living, breathing nervous system of the most powerful indigenous confederacy in North America, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois. The French and later the English colonists were baffled. Their entire military doctrine was built on supply lines, clear roads, and the speed of a horse. Yet here, in this vast wilderness, their fastest couriers were consistently beaten by men on foot. How could a runner, carrying almost nothing, cover distances that seemed physically impossible, up to 100 miles in a single day? How could the Iroquois coordinate armies and diplomacy across a territory of thousands of square miles in mere days? This was, to the European mind, a strategic impossibility. By the end of this journey, you will understand the grueling training, the unique culture, and the impossible physiology of the Iroquois runners, the men who held an empire together at a sprint. Section 1, the Green Ocean. To understand the runner, you must first understand the world he moved through. The North American interior of the 17th century was not a collection of forests. It was one forest, a single continental entanglement stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi. A green ocean of biomass so dense that in many places a man could travel for a week and never see the sun. To the European settler, this was a place of profound dread. It was an obstacle, an enemy. Their journals are filled with terror of getting lost, of the trackless wilderness, of the gloom of the deep woods. Their technology was a liability here. A horse, the symbol of speed and power in the open fields of Europe, was a fragile burden. It required wide, clear paths. It needed massive quantities of fodder, which had to be carried. Its legs were easily broken by hidden roots or mud holes. A cavalryman in a steel breastplate was a slow, noisy, and conspicuous target. But to the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, this forest was not a barrier. It was their home. It was their fortress, their larder, and their highway, and they had built an empire within it. The Iroquois Confederacy, known as the Five Nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, was a sophisticated political and military alliance. Their territory, a swath of modern-day New York, was strategically vital. They controlled the Door, the critical river and lake routes that connected the French in Canada, the English in New York, and the vast, fur-rich interior. Their central government, a council of 50 sachems, met at the Central Fire in Onondaga. But how do you govern a territory that large? How do you demand tribute from a conquered tribe 300 miles away? How do you mobilize 1,000 warriors from 5 different nations to intercept a French invasion force before that force reaches your first village? You cannot if your messages travel at the speed of a European. A French dispatch rider, leaving Montreal for Detroit, might take 3 to 4 weeks, battling rivers, portaging canoes, and resting his horses. A message from Albany to Boston on the good Colonial roads could still take the better part of a week. The Haudenosaunee had a different system. They had a network of footpaths, narrow trails worn into the earth over centuries, invisible to the untrained eye. These paths connected their castles, their large fortified villages of bark longhouses, and stretched deep into the lands of their allies and their enemies. And upon these paths they unleashed the Roskanekatakoane, the great swift-footed ones, the runners. When a scout on the St. Lawrence River spotted a mobilization of French troops de la Marine and their Algonquin allies, he did not paddle a canoe back. He ran. He ran to the first Mohawk village, where the message, perhaps encoded in a notched stick or a wampum string, was handed to a fresh runner. That runner would sprint to the next station, and the next. The message flew south. It moved not at the speed of a horse fighting the wilderness, but at the speed of a human being perfectly adapted to it. Section 2, a shock to the system. Jesuit missionaries, men of letters accustomed to precise record-keeping, were the first to document this phenomenon. Their relations, annual reports sent back to Paris, are filled with a mixture of professional admiration and pure disbelief. Father Paul Lejeune, writing in the 1630s, noted that his Algonquin guides, when pressed, could cover 30 to 40 leagues in a single day. That is 90 to 120 miles. He wrote it down as a fact, but it was a fact that defied all European logic. Baron de La Hontan, a French soldier and notorious skeptic, observed the same. He described Iroquois warriors moving at a great rate, covering in one day the same distance his own French regulars, burdened with muskets, powder, and rations, would take 3 or 4 days to cross. These weren't boasts, they were stunned field reports. Let's be clear about what 100 miles a day truly means. This is not 100 miles on a flat Roman road. This is 100 miles through the primeval forest of fable. It means climbing over thousands of fallen trees, scrambling up rocky ravines, wading through ice-cold streams and dense wetlands, all while maintaining a relentless, shuffling trot that consumed the ground. A European on horseback could, on a good colonial road, perhaps make 30 miles in a day before his animal was spent. In the deep woods, that same horse was lucky to make 15. The Iroquois runner had no such limitations. He was an all-terrain vehicle, powered by an internal furnace. He carried almost nothing. His technology was his own body. For provisions, he carried a small pouch of otsikeeta, parched corn, pulverized into a fine flour and mixed with maple sugar. This was the original high-energy food. A spoonful mixed with water from a stream was enough to fuel him for hours. He didn't need a supply train. He didn't need to stop and graze a horse. He didn't carry a tent, a heavy wool blanket, or an iron cookpot. He was a system of pure, self-contained motion. When the Haudenosaunee needed to convey a vital message, a declaration of war, a call for a peace treaty, or a warning of an enemy movement, they didn't dispatch one man. They activated a human telegraph. The runner, carrying the wampum belt that served as his credential and his mnemonic device, would sprint from his village to a pre-arranged station, perhaps a small hunting camp or a neighboring settlement 20 or 30 miles away. There, a fresh runner, rested and waiting, would take the belt and immediately begin the next leg. A message could leave the eastern door, the castles of the Mohawk near Albany, and reach the western door, the great villages of the Seneca near the Niagara frontier, in less than 48 hours. This was a distance of nearly 300 miles. To the French in Montreal or the English in New York, this was supernatural. It meant that before their own formal declaration of war could even be copied by a clerk, the entire Iroquois Confederacy was already mobilized. It meant their secret troop movements were known and analyzed by the Onondaga Council before their own scouts had even returned to base. This speed wasn't just a curiosity, it was a terrifying strategic advantage. And it was no accident. It was the product of a culture that identified, cultivated, and perfected human endurance from the moment a child could walk. Section 3. Forged in the forest. This education began in the organized chaos of a Haudenosaunee castle, a large village of bark longhouses, often surrounded by a triple palisade of 20-foot timbers. From their earliest years, boys were encouraged to run. Everywhere. They were sent on errands to neighboring villages, tasked with hunting small game, and thrown into the most demanding sport on the continent. Tuaraton or lacrosse. The Jesuit father Jean de Brebeuf, living among the Huron, an Iroquoian-speaking people, in 1636, described it with awe. He called it the Creator's Game. But it was also the little brother of war. These games were not casual affairs. They were massive, chaotic, and brutal. The field wasn't a defined 100-yard rectangle. It could be miles long, the goals being 2 trees or rock formations on opposite ends of a valley. Teams could number in the hundreds. A game could last from sunup to sundown for 2 or 3 consecutive days. For a Haudenosaunee boy, lacrosse was the primary crucible. It built the wind that would be needed later. It was a non-stop sprint, grapple, and cross-country run, all while cradling a deerskin ball in a hickory wood stick. A boy who excelled here, who could run all day and still fight for the ball at dusk, was identified. He was a potential runner. As these promising youths grew, the training became specific and intensely rigorous. It was a hardening process, designed to strip away all weakness and make the body immune to the complaints of the flesh. An elder, often a renowned runner himself, would take the boys on long-distance mock hunts or simple message runs. These were tests. In the dead of winter, they would be ordered to strip and plunge into holes cut in the ice of a river. The shock of the cold meant to thicken the blood and build resistance to the elements. They were taught to run through snowdrifts for hours, wearing only moccasins and a breechclout. They were taught to use the cold, to see it as a tool, not an enemy. They also learned the science of fasting. A runner would be sent on a 2-day run with no food at all, only a small pouch of water. This forced his body to adapt, to learn to metabolize its own fat stores efficiently, to endure the gnawing hunger and mental fog until it became a familiar, manageable sensation. Perhaps most jarring to the European sensibility was the practice of scarification. The shins, thighs, and calves of a young runner would be purposefully scraped with a sharpened bone, a snake's tooth, or a flint chip. Not deep enough to lame, but enough to draw blood. This ritual, often accompanied by specific herbs, was believed to make the limbs lighter and swifter, a painful but necessary rite of passage to toughen the legs for the endless pounding. But the most critical piece of this education was not the toughness, but the technique. The Iroquois runner did not sprint. Sprinting burns glycogen and builds lactic acid. It's unsustainable. He did not jog, which is often too slow and bouncy. He loped. Europeans who saw it called it the Indian pace, or the dog trot. It was a rhythmic, relentless, shuffling gait, biomechanically perfect for the forest floor. The foot was placed with precision, landing mid-foot, the body leaning slightly forward, arms held relaxed. There was almost no vertical movement. All energy was channeled into forward motion. It was, in modern terms, the gait of an elite ultramarathon. It was a pace that could be maintained for 18 hours straight. It consumed the ground. It was a living embodiment of the Haudenosaunee worldview, not to fight the forest, but to flow through it, to read the invisible trail, to navigate by the angle of the sun, the flow of a creek, or the specific species of moss on a rock. This was a man who could run, eat, and navigate simultaneously. He would scoop his otsicaheta flour and maple sugar into his palm, add water from a stream without breaking stride, and eat the resulting paste as he moved. He was a human machine, forged in the forest. And in the 18th century, as the great colonial powers of France and Britain prepared for a final war for the continent, this human machine would become the most valuable strategic asset in North America. Section 4. A Weapon of Speed. Lake George, New York, September 8, 1755. This is the flashpoint. The French and Indian War, the American theater of the global 7 Years' War, is exploding. A French army of 1,500 regulars, Canadian militia, and allied warriors under the command of Baron Dieskau is pushing south from Fort St. Frederick. Their target, the new, half-built British bastion of Fort Lyman. But Dieskau has a problem. His allied Caughnawaga Mohawk, Iroquois who had converted to Catholicism and settled near Montreal, refused to lead an attack on a fort. It is not their way of war. They will, however, gladly attack the main British colonial army, camped at the southern tip of Lake George, a force led by the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson. Johnson is a man who understands the Haudenosaunee. He lives among the Mohawk, speaks their language, and is an adopted member of their nation. He has built his entire army and alliance around them. Dieskau, frustrated, changes his plan. He will lead a surprise assault on Johnson's main camp. It is a brilliant tactical move. His force is hidden by the dense forest. No European scout could possibly detect him and return to Johnson in time. But he isn't being watched by Europeans. In the pre-dawn light, Johnson's Mohawk allies, led by the revered old Sachem King Hendrik, have scouts fanned out for miles. They detect the movement. They see the green and white uniforms of the Régiment de Lorraine, the blue of the Canadian militia. They read the signs, the number of men, the direction of their march, and then they run. The runners, men trained in the crucible of the Tuaraton and the winter hunts, fly back to Johnson's camp. They don't use the main road Dieskau is on. They melt into the forest, taking the invisible paths. They arrive at Johnson's camp hours before the French, delivering a precise, terrifying report. A large enemy force is close and moving fast. Johnson, acting on this impossible intelligence, makes a fateful decision. He dispatches a 1,000-man relief force, including 200 of King Hendrik's Mohawk warriors, to intercept the French. They march straight into Dieskau's perfectly laid trap. The French are hidden in a horseshoe formation along the forest road. When the British and Mohawk enter, the trap is sprung. A devastating volley tears through the column. The bloody morning scout has begun. King Hendrik, old and too large to run, is bayoneted to death. Colonel Ephraim Williams, the British commander, is shot through the head. The column breaks. The men panic. It is a rout. This should be the end of the battle. Dieskau's regulars fix bayonets and charge, expecting to chase the survivors all the way back to Johnson's camp and finish them both. But they have underestimated the runners. The Mohawk warriors and the fastest of the colonial militia do not just retreat. They run. They run with the speed of men forged by the Haudenosaunee system. They run faster than the French regulars can possibly chase them. Sound of musket fire, men screaming, pounding footsteps. Back at the camp, Sir William Johnson hears the growing roar of gunfire. Then, bursting from the trees, come the survivors. They are not a disorganized mob. They are a living alarm bell. They sprint the last quarter mile, screaming, "Dieskau! Dieskau! To the barricades!" They arrive at the camp mere minutes ahead of the French charge. That warning, delivered at a dead sprint, is just enough. Johnson's men grab their muskets and man their crude breastwork of overturned wagons, logs, and boats. When Dieskau's white-coated regulars emerge from the forest, expecting to find a panicked, unready camp, they are met by a disciplined, coordinated wall of lead. The Battle of Lake George turns from a French victory into a bloody British triumph. Baron Dieskau himself is wounded and captured. The victory, which secured the British northern frontier, was not won by muskets alone. It was won by speed. It was won by a communication network that could turn a tactical disaster into a strategic victory. a network that moved at the speed of a running man, a speed the French, with all their European military doctrine, simply could not comprehend or counter. Section 5. The severing of the chain. For decades, this system was the political and military heartbeat of the Haudenosaunee. The runners were not just scouts or messengers, they were the ligaments of a unified body politic. They were the men who carried the wampum. Sound of rattling shells, a low council chant. Imagine the central fire at Onondaga, the capital of the Confederacy. A runner appears at the edge of the clearing. He has traveled 150 miles in 2 days. He is not out of breath. He walks with purpose to the Council of Sachems and presents a belt of purple and white shells. He is not just delivering a message, he is delivering a treaty. The patterns in the wampum are a legal document, a binding agreement. This speed meant the Haudenosaunee operated on a different political timeline from the Europeans. They could gather their leaders, debate a proposal from the governor of New York, formulate a unified response, and have that response delivered to Albany before the governor's own couriers had even returned from Boston. They controlled the tempo of diplomacy and war across the entire Northeast. But in 775, a new war erupted. A war not between distant kings in France and England, but a family quarrel between the British and their own American colonists. This war, the American Revolution, would present the Haudenosaunee with an impossible choice. The Confederacy, which had balanced the French and British empires for a century, was now itself caught in the middle. The chain of friendship that bound the 6 nations the Tuscarora had joined in 1722 was strained to the breaking point. At Onondaga, the great council fire was formally extinguished. The Confederacy, unable to agree on a unified path, declared its neutrality and told each of the 6 nations to choose its own side. It was a political catastrophe. The Mohawk, led by the charismatic war leader Thayendanegea, Joseph Brant, sided with their old allies, the British. The Seneca and Cayuga followed. But the Oneida and Tuscarora, influenced by American missionaries, allied with the revolutionaries. The Haudenosaunee Longhouse was broken. Brother was now at war with brother, and the American commander-in-chief, George Washington, knew exactly how deadly the Haudenosaunee system was. He had fought in the French and Indian War. He had seen its speed. He knew that as long as the Iroquois castles stood, with their vast granaries and their network of runners, his entire western frontier would be vulnerable to lightning raids. In 1779, Washington gave an order that would change the landscape forever. He commanded General John Sullivan to lead a massive campaign into the Iroquois heartland. The order was not to conquer, but to destroy. Washington's words were blunt: the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. The Sullivan expedition was not a war of battles, it was a war of extinction. 4,500 Continental Army soldiers, a full quarter of Washington's entire force, marched north. The Iroquois runners did their duty. They ran. They warned of Sullivan's scorched earth advance. But what good is a warning against an army that large when your own allies are scattered? The runners who had once carried messages of unified war parties now carried messages of pure desperation. Flee. For 3 months, Sullivan's army burned the Green Ocean. They torched more than 40 Haudenosaunee castles, some containing over 120 longhouses. They chopped down ancient orchards that had fed the people for generations. And most critically, they burned the corn. They burned millions of bushels of corn. Corn that was dried and stored. Corn that was ripe in the fields. They burned the Otsikeheta. They destroyed the fuel. The human telegraph was severed. A runner cannot run on an empty stomach. A relay system cannot function when the relay stations are smoking piles of ash. The network of paths, built over 1,000 years, now connected only ruins. The surviving Seneca, Cayuga, and Mohawk fled, starving to the British at Fort Niagara, becoming refugees. The Iroquois heartland was left a vast, vacant plain of embers. The impossible speed of the Haudenosaunee runner had finally been defeated, not by a faster man, and not by a faster horse. It was defeated by the systematic destruction of its food, its homes, and the political unity that gave it purpose. The forest itself, their greatest ally, was burned away. Section 6. An echo in the forest. The end, when it came, was not a single battle, but a signature on a piece of paper. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784, followed by a series of coercive and often fraudulent land deals, finalized what Sullivan's army had begun. The Haudenosaunee, abandoned by their British allies, were forced to cede almost all of their ancestral territory. The green ocean that had been their fortress was now open for settlement. The world that had created the runner was vanishing. The dense, trackless wilderness was being systematically clear-cut. The invisible footpaths were being erased, plowed under for farms, or widened into wagon roads. Where a runner once loped through a maze of hemlock and pine, stagecoaches now rumbled, and men on horseback could finally move faster. The runner's impossible speed had always been a function of his environment. He was faster than a horse in the wilderness, but in a world of graded roads, canals, and fenced fields, his advantage was gone. The European had not adapted to the forest. He had simply destroyed it and replaced it with a world that suited his own technology. The Haudenosaunee were confined to small reservations, islands of what remained of their land. The Longhouse, as a political entity stretching across New York, was broken. The runner's occupation was gone. There were no more strategic messages to carry between castles. There was no central fire at Onondaga to run to. The Tewaaraton Games continued, but they were now just a game, a cultural echo of the little brother of war that had once trained the nervous system of an empire. The feats of endurance, however, were not forgotten. They passed into the realm of legend, and sometimes into the stunned observations of a new generation. In the 19th century, accounts would still surface. An American settler or a military surveyor would hire an Iroquois guide, only to watch, bewildered, as the man set off at the same relentless dog trot his ancestors had used. He would cover 50 or 60 miles of civilized land before dusk, just to deliver a simple letter and then be ready to run back the next day. These observers saw it as a curiosity, an incredible feat of individual stamina. They failed to see what it truly was. It was an echo. It was the ghost of a continental network, a living remnant of a time when the fate of empires, the mobilization of armies, and the survival of a people depended not on a horse, not on a wire, but on the otsikeheta in a pouch, and the unbelievable power of the human body, perfected for a single purpose: to be faster than the forest. Pause. Call to action. The story of the Haudenosaunee runners is a powerful reminder that for centuries, human endurance and adaptation, not technology, shaped the destiny of a continent. What part of this incredible human achievement amazed you the most? If you found this history as fascinating as we do, please share this video with a friend and subscribe for more hidden stories from history.